Selavorn stood in the communications suite of a returning shuttle, recording a final, desperate message. Her people had just been erased from galactic protection. A Varrocan fleet was already repositioning. She sent the transmission into empty space with no real hope of an answer. 4 days later, a human captain named Yara Osei arrived with a small ship and 9 crew members. She said they had heard the message and they were not leaving. The vote took 11 seconds. 11 seconds to undo 300 years of promises. My name is Selavorn, and I was the youngest diplomat the Threnathi Concord had sent to the Galactic Assembly in 40 years. I was there because my government believed my presence would signal something: youth, possibility, the hope that the Assembly was still an institution worth sending young people to. I was there when they erased us from their records. The Assembly Hall on Station Korath was enormous in the way that only things built to house the egos of 14 species can be: enormous ceilings that disappeared into light. Chambers arranged in concentric rings of authority, the oldest members at the center, the newest at the edges. The Threnathi delegation sat at the outer ring. We had always sat at the outer ring. 2 centuries of membership, and we had never moved inward. Because inward meant resources, and resources meant leverage, and leverage was a game we had never been given the tools to play. Elder Palo Ven sat beside me, his hands folded on the table. He had been a diplomat for 60 years. I had watched him navigate threats and insults in the quiet violence of procedural maneuvering without ever letting his face betray what he was thinking. His face betrayed him that day. The speaker, a karate named Osran Mail, read the resolution without looking at us. His voice had the quality of someone reading a list of expired contracts, efficient, slightly bored, utterly indifferent to what the words actually meant to the people they were about. The Threnathi Concord has failed to meet tributary assessment standards for 4 consecutive cycles. The Assembly therefore withdraws all protected status, all collective defense guarantees, and all preferential trade access previously extended. Effective immediately. He set the document down. He moved to the next agenda item. I looked around the chamber at species we had fought beside, traded with, negotiated for during conflicts that had nothing to do with us, because we believed that was what membership meant. The Serati, whose colony corridor we had helped defend at the cost of 2 of our own ships. The Illith, who had once called the Threnathi the quiet anchors of the Outer Rim in a formal address that was now apparently worth less than the energy required to generate it. Not one of them raised a hand. Not one of them met my eyes. I was 26 years old, sitting at the outer edge of a chamber full of the most powerful species in the known galaxy, watching them move on to the next item on their list, and somewhere beyond the Assembly's jurisdiction. In the dark between our border and Vrokan space, sensor records we would only see later showed 7 Vrokan warships changing course at the exact moment our protection was revoked. They had known, they had been waiting. Elder Palo Ven did not speak until we were back aboard our shuttle, ascending through Korath's orbital ring toward the transit dock. When he did, he said one thing: "We have perhaps 72 hours before they test our border." He was wrong. We had 40-8, the flight home was 31 hours. I spent most of it in the communications suite, running transmissions I knew were increasingly pointless, formal protests to the Assembly, requests for emergency review, queries to the 3 species who had always been closest to us diplomatically, asking if any of them would consider even a temporary mutual defense agreement. 2 did not respond. 1 responded to say they were, regrettably, unable to take positions that might affect their standing with the Assembly majority. I understood what that meant. I deleted the response and sat in the dim light of the communications room, listening to the hum of the transit drive, staring at a database of transmission frequencies that included contacts, allies, neutral parties, and at the very bottom of the list, a category labeled unaffiliated species, Outer Rim Registry. The entry for humanity was sparse. We had never formally engaged them. The Assembly's documentation on them was dismissive: developing civilization, outer expansion phase, limited galactic engagement, notable for emotional volatility and inconsistent policy. The kind of summary written by someone who had decided what they thought before they looked. I opened a channel to their listed frequencies anyway. Not because I believed it would work, because I had nothing left to lose in 48 hours and 320,000 people living on a homeworld that was about to lose the last thing standing between it and a fleet that had been waiting for exactly this moment. I recorded the message in my own voice. I did not use formal titles. I did not use the careful diplomatic phrasing I had been trained to deploy. I was 26 years old and exhausted and frightened, and the people I had trusted to build something worth protecting had just erased us from their paperwork. I said, "This is Selavorn of the Threnathi Concord. Our protection has been revoked by the Galactic Assembly. We do not know if this message will reach anyone capable of helping. We do not know if anyone will choose to answer. If you receive this, we are not asking out of strategy. We are asking because we have nowhere else left to turn." I sent it on every frequency in that Outer Rim registry. Then I went back to my seat and watched the stars move past the viewport and told myself I had done everything I could, which was true, and that it would be enough, which I did not believe. We had 41 hours before the first Vrokan ships crossed our outer marker. They did not fire. Not immediately. They held position just inside what had been protected space, close enough for our sensors to track their formation clearly, far enough to maintain deniability for another few hours. Our defense command convened in the primary station above Threnactal. I was in the room. Elder Paolo Ven was at the head of the table. Every face in that room looked the way faces look when the numbers have been done, and the numbers are not good. We had 14 functional warships. The Vrocken formation was 32 vessels, with more on approach. The discussion was precise and professional, and underneath its precision was the specific quality of people deciding how to be brave about something they could not actually survive. On the second day, I stopped checking the message log. On the third day, a single unregistered ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of our system. I was in the defense station's observation wing when the alert came through. My first instinct was that it was a Vrocken advanced scout. My second instinct, half a second later, was that the configuration was wrong. Too small, too functional-looking, without the sharp aggressive design language that Vrocken military vessels favored. It was broadcasting on all frequencies simultaneously. The translation came through imperfect at first. Their language had a rhythm our systems hadn't encountered before, but the meaning resolved within seconds. We received a transmission 4 days ago from an individual identifying themselves as Celavorn of the Threnathi Concord. We are here in response to that transmission. I stood in the observation wing of a station orbiting a homeworld with 14 warships between it and 32 hostile vessels, and I started laughing, not because it was funny, because the alternative was crying. And I had been saving that for later. Her name was Yara Uset. She was compact and direct, with the particular efficiency of someone who had learned that most situations benefit from less preparation and more action. She came through the airlock of our docking station with a crew of 9 and extended her hand in a gesture I recognized from cultural records. The human greeting, an offering of the open palm, historically meaningful in ways their own scholars still debated. I shook it. I had never done it before. I hoped I did it correctly. "Officer Vaughn," she said. "I listened to your message 3 times. I want you to know we don't take it lightly." I didn't expect anyone to answer. I said, "We almost didn't come." Her voice was matter-of-fact, not apologetic. There were arguments. Some people back home think we're moving too quickly into things we don't fully understand. But when I played your recording for our council, she paused, and something shifted briefly in her expression. Something genuine beneath the efficiency. You didn't sound like someone asking for advantage. You sounded like someone asking for help. That made the decision simpler. Elder Paolo Ven was in the room. He had been watching her since she stepped through the airlock with the careful attention of someone who had spent 60 years reading people. He said, "Captain, the Assembly has characterized your people as emotionally volatile and unsuited for serious diplomatic engagement." I asked plainly, why would you risk your people and your resources for a species you have never formally engaged, based on a single unauthorized transmission? Yara Osei looked at him steadily. "Because we never signed their assessment agreements," she said. "And because when an entire civilization gets abandoned by its allies over resource quotas, the correct response isn't to ask whose fault it is, it's to help." She paused. "We don't need the Assembly's permission to decide that." Paolo Ven studied her for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "No, I suppose you don't." More human ships arrived over the following 2 days. Not a fleet in any formal sense. They came in 1s and 3s and small groups, transports, independent vessels, ships that looked like they had been built for cargo and repurposed for this. Their designs were inconsistent in the way that things built by many different people for many different purposes are inconsistent, and they took up positions in our orbital approach with the organized improvisation of people who had decided on a common goal without being given a common plan. "It's a little chaotic," Yara admitted, watching the same orbital display I was watching. "Once footage from my first broadcast reached our networks, people started moving without waiting for central coordination. We can work with it." "How?" I asked. "The same way humans have always worked with it," she said. "We figure it out as we go." The Vrocken commander, a veteran officer whose designation our records translated as Fleet Second Korath, had, on the 4th day, it stopped mattering what he had decided. His fleet moved. Not a probe, not a test, a coordinated assault at full advance, the kind of movement that doesn't leave room for negotiation or retreat. The human ships moved to meet them. What followed is difficult to describe in the clean sequential language of a formal report, because it was not clean and it was not sequential. It was improvised and costly and remarkable. Human ships that had no common tactical doctrine found a working pattern through open-channel communication that sometimes sounded more like a heated argument than a military operation. They called warnings to each other. They covered each other's gaps. When the Vrocken formation targeted our primary shield relay, the one failure point that would have cascaded through our entire defensive grid, 3 human ships that had been positioned on the far side of the engagement turned and moved toward it without being ordered to. I watched it happen from the defense station. I watched a vessel I later learned belonged to a volunteer named Paradas, a small ship. not rated for this kind of engagement, position itself between concentrated Verican fire and the relay housing and hold that position until our engineers completed an emergency reinforcement sequence. Her ship took 3 direct hits. She did not move. When the reinforcement completed and the relay stabilized, her ship was venting from 2 sections, and her response on the open channel, when Yara called to check her status, was still here. What do you need next? The Vrocken formation held for 40 more minutes after the relay survived. Then Korath began his withdrawal. No dramatic announcement, no declaration of retreat. The formation simply began to contract and reorient. The slow, deliberate movement of a commander who had run the revised numbers and arrived at a different answer than the one he'd started with. He had come expecting a defenseless world. He had found something he hadn't budgeted for, which was the specific and apparently genuine willingness of an unfamiliar species to be damaged defending something that wasn't theirs. The assembly convened an emergency review 10 days after the battle. Elder Palo Ven attended, I attended, Yara Asay attended, representing a species that had never been formally part of the assembly's structure and showed no particular inclination to start now. Speaker Osran Male, who had read our dissolution without looking at us, now spoke with the careful language of a person acutely aware of being watched by everyone who had seen Ethan Moore's broadcasts. The human crew member who had recorded and transmitted everything throughout the crisis, on every available frequency. He said the assembly wished to formally reconsider the Threnathi status and to offer restored protections under standard guidelines. Palo Ven waited until he finished. Then he said, "We appreciate the Council's reconsideration. I would ask one question. Where was this concern before a species we had never formally met chose of their own will to stand beside us? Would this reconsideration exist if no one had been watching?" The chamber did not answer because the chamber knew. We accepted partial re-engagement with the assembly, not the full restoration of previous status. Palo Ven's position on that was quiet and firm, and he did not move from it. We re-established trade access in certain communication frameworks. We did not restore the full tributary protection agreement that had proven, once, to be worth exactly as much as the conditions attached to it. What we did instead was formalize, in a document that was brief and plain and did not require elaborate ceremony, a mutual cooperation agreement with humanity. It had no quota requirements, it had no tributary assessment schedule, it had no withdrawal provisions triggered by resource shortfalls. It said, in language that Yara Osay had apparently written herself in the straightforward style her people favored, the parties to this agreement recognize that the most fundamental form of alliance is the choice, freely made, to show up when it matters. We commit to showing up. Palo Ven signed it. Yara signed it. I was in the room when they did, standing in the back the way I had learned to stand in rooms where important things were decided. 3 months later, I was reviewing a routine data transfer from the Assembly's public archive, the kind of administrative material that diplomatic staff process daily without expecting to find anything significant. I found something significant. Buried in the documentation from the Assembly session that had revoked our protection was a procedural attachment, the kind that records which parties were consulted during the drafting of a resolution. Standard practice, usually unremarkable. The attachment listed 12 species consulted during the formation of the resolution that had erased us. The Vrocken Compact was among them, not as a party to the vote, as a consulted party, a technical distinction. One that meant the species whose fleet had repositioned before the vote was finalized had been part of the conversation about whether to strip our protection. I sat with that document for a long time. The vote hadn't been a failure of the Assembly's systems. It hadn't been neglect or indifference or the slow erosion of a once principled institution. It had been a transaction. Someone had offered something, and the Assembly had accepted it. And the resolution that followed had provided the Vrocken Compact with exactly what they needed to move on us without triggering the collective defense provisions that would have required a response. We had not been abandoned. We had been sold. I took the document to Palo Ven. He read it twice, set it down, and sat in silence for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. "How many other species," he said, "do you think received the same treatment and never found out?" I didn't have an answer. He nodded slowly, as if I had confirmed something he had already suspected, and that, he said, is what we do next. Not to the Assembly, not a protest or a formal complaint. He meant something different, and I understood it immediately. The broadcasts that Yara's crew had maintained throughout the crisis, the visibility that had turned a private abandonment into a public reckoning, the principle that silence was the mechanism, and exposure was the answer. We sent the document to Yara Osay. Her response came back in 4 hours. It said, "We've been wondering how they kept this so clean for so long. Now we know. Send us everything you have." The work that followed was slow and careful and less dramatic than a battle. It involved archive requests and data cross-references and the patient, unglamorous labor of building an evidentiary record that could not be dismissed as accusation. It is still ongoing. I do not know how it will end. What I know is this: the galaxy abandoned us with a vote that took 11 seconds. And in the wreckage of that abandonment, in the desperate transmission sent into nothing from a shuttle traveling home to a world that was already being circled, we found something the Assembly's calculation had not accounted for. A species that hadn't been part of the transaction, that had no position in the Assembly's political architecture, that had nothing to gain and everything potentially to lose, that had answered anyway, and for the first time in 300 years of careful, obligated, quota-driven diplomacy. My people understood what it felt like to stand beside someone who was there not because a treaty said they had to be, but because they decided to. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that the most extraordinary thing a civilization can do is simply show up when someone asks, subscribe. There are more human stories from the stars, and in every one of them, when the moment came, we answered.